Hi, my name is Grace Doolin, and I will be talking about LGBTQ sex education in the states of Illinois, Kentucky, and Missouri. The policy problem that I will be tackling in this presentation is the fact that sex education on queer topics in America is both too inconsistent and content-wise insufficient to meet the needs of queer youth. While the federal government does hold an important role in the Department of Education and the standardization of American education, largely in America, state and local levels of government are in charge of the creation and implementation of most education policies. States create standards and guidance, and then local school districts apply those state guidelines and create their own policies as needed. Sex education is no different in this aspect. As well, like with all other aspects of educational equity, racial and economic disparities are rife when it comes to who gets inclusive and quality sex education instruction. It is also important to note that federal funding for sex education is entirely dependent on who is president. So it has, in the last couple of years, recently been swinging back and forth when it comes to whether the federal government is pro-sex education and equitable sex education. Project 2025 and Trump's campaign promises of getting rid of the Department of Education and removing woke politics and LGBT ideologies from the American government and education system have put a lot of what supports the federal government will have for sex ed up in the air, leaving this largely a state and local issue, which is why this is the best level of government to tackle this policy issue. Why is equitable access to queer topics in sex education important? Well, a 2021 study by GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Educational Network, found that just over 87% of queer students received no education on queer sex ed topics, either because they were not covered in their sex ed or they did not get sex ed, period. Only 7.4% of queer students got sex education that was inclusive of both transgender and non-binary people, as well as gay, lesbian, and bisexual people. In 2021, the CDC survey of the Youth Risk Behavioral Surveillance System found that almost a quarter of all high schoolers identify with some queer identity. The majority of those students that identify as queer identify as either gay or bisexual. Gay and bisexual young men are more likely than their heterosexual peers to contract HIV. In 2013, gay and bisexual young men also made up 2/3 of new syphilis cases. Gay and bisexual women are more likely to get pregnant than their heterosexual peers, and also more likely to have unfortunately had an experience with coercion or lack of consent in a sexual encounter. Queer youth are more likely than their heterosexual peers to search out sexual health information online. This means that they are more likely to come across misinformation and all of the myths and weird things that happen when you search for sexual content online as a minor. Yet again, this puts queer youth at a higher risk than their heterosexual and cisgender peers. Not having proper instruction on sexual topics that actually pertain to how you are going to live your life has real important, possibly life and death health impacts for queer youth and queer students from being a child all the way into adulthood. It has lifelong impacts if you are not able to get accurate information on your own body. According to UK-based sexual health charity Family Planning Association, comprehensive sex education has been shown to have many positive impacts on students of all identity groups. Students are less likely to have their first sexual encounter be non-consensual. There is less likelihood that they will experience a non-consensual encounter, period. There are fewer pregnancies, fewer sexually transmitted infections or diseases. Young people are less likely to engage in sexually risky behaviors, and generally sexual health is just much stronger if, shockingly, you know what sexual health means. According to the American Academy of Pediatrics, there are 6 key topics that need to be included in any sex ed curriculum. 2 of these, human development and society and culture, have queerness deeply integrated into these topics. sexual orientation, gender identity, gender roles, diversity, and the intersectionality of the law, religion, media, and the arts all very much involve queerness and are all deemed integral to having basic functional knowledge about sex ed. GLSEN deems LGBT inclusive sex ed as includes positive representations of both LGBT and transgender and non-binary topics. This is what I am talking about when I am discussing comprehensive queer inclusive sex ed. The focus of my case will be on policies surrounding queer topics in sex education in Illinois, Kentucky, and Missouri. Illinois, despite having conservative pockets in the south and west of the state, is considered a blue state, with Democrats holding a trifecta in the state government, with solid majorities in the state house, state senate, and holding the governorship. Kentucky is a very Republican state on a strange area between the southeast and the Midwest. In its state legislature, Republicans hold a supermajority in both the state house and the state senate, but the governorship is controlled by Democrat Andy Beshear. In Missouri, Republicans hold a trifecta there, having majorities in both the legislature, lower chamber in the House, and the upper chamber in the Senate, as well as holding the governorship. How Illinois sex education curriculum and standards are set up is that sex education is something that local districts opt into, and that parents can opt out of, meaning that schools do not have to teach sex education, and if they do, parents can pull their kids out of it. If districts teach sex education, it is required to be medically accurate, culturally appropriate, age and developmentally appropriate, trauma-informed, evidence-based, inclusive of sexual and gender diversity, include both abstinence and discussion of contraception options, as well as mentioning consent and healthy relationships. The Illinois Board of Education organizes sex education topics into 7 strands or units, which are consent and healthy relationships, anatomy and physiology, puberty and adolescent sexual development, gender identity and expression, sexual orientation and identity, sexual health, and interpersonal violence. While the actual content may sound great, the fact that there is no actual requirement to teach students any of it means that there are huge barriers to a lot of students actually getting that fantastic content. A lack of funding for sex ed is a huge barrier to school districts opting into the curriculum. There is no additional funding provided to the districts who opt in, and bills to give that funding or provide grants have died in committee in the last 2 legislative sessions, while bills to make the requirements better have actually passed, because spending money is hard, but saying that if you have to teach, you have to teach well, without actually providing the resources or additional help to do so is very easy. The Sexuality Information and Education Council of the United States, or SIECUS, is a nonprofit that monitors sex ed policies across the United States. They gave Illinois an overall grade of A-, with a C grade for sex ed requirements and an A+ grade for content. They also found that only about 61% of high schoolers in Illinois got any kind of instruction, positive or not, on sexual orientation and gender topics. In 2020, UCLA found that there were about 80,000 queer teens ages 13 to 17 in Illinois. That is to say that there is no way to know how many of those students were in a school district that opted into sex ed. There is no way to know if they got the support that they needed. And that's part of the problem with not actually requiring sex education and not giving schools the funding that they need to provide quality and inclusive sex education to their queer students. All high schools in Kentucky are required to offer sex education, but parents have to opt in for their students to actually take it. The curriculum is required to push marriage and teach abstinence, quote, as the goal for students. It is not required to be medically accurate. It does not have to teach about consent, and there are extremely heavy regulations of queer topics due to a sprawling anti-LGBT bill called SB 150 that went into effect last year. It is Kentucky's version of Florida's Don't Say Gay bill, and it is not just limited to regulating sex education. Part of the bill is currently up in the Supreme Court for review, but that case is focused on prohibitions on gender affirming care for youth, not the sex education requirements. So unfortunately, there have been no challenges to the fact that people can't talk about queerness in sex ed classes in Kentucky. CICUS found that in 2021, 64% of high schoolers got some sort of education on sexual orientation, which is actually higher than Illinois'. But due to that 2023 law, teachers are no longer allowed to talk about queer subjects and are actually, because of that, very heavily regulated on how they could talk about sexuality and gender, period, not just in queer senses. Kentucky's Don't Say Gay bill actually passed over a governor's veto by getting re-voted on in the state legislature with an overwhelming amount of support. But it did not go without criticism. This is what Governor Andy Beshear had to say before the bill initially passed.
And I have real concerns based on what I've heard about the bill, that it'll increase bullying in our schools, especially for students that are already marginalized. As a parent of two middle schoolers, school's hard and bullying is real. We ought to be really thoughtful that we don't do things that subject our kids, anybody's kids, no matter who they are, to more bullying.
CICUS gave Kentucky an overall grade of F, with a D for their requirement and an F for their actual content. In 2020, UCLA found that there were 27,000 queer teens ages 13 to 17 in Kentucky. That number has likely only risen, as every statistic about queer youth has risen in the last few years. But that is to say that at least 27,000 children are experiencing having their sexual health intentionally marginalized by the state. Sex ed is not required in Missouri, but some sexual health topics are required under a general health curriculum, such as HIV, AIDS, and STDs, STIs. That being said, for the schools that do opt into sex education, parents can opt out at any time. And there is no requirement that sexual orientation or gender be involved in that curriculum. CICUS overall gave Missouri a C rating and gave them a C on both their requirements and their content. According to UCLA, 37,000 queer teens ages 13 to 17 live in Missouri. That means that, again, we don't know how many of them actually got quality education on their own sexual health. Where Illinois requires that any sex education that happens must be inclusive to gender and sexual diversity, and Kentucky, on the very opposite end, completely bans any kind of mentioning positive reference to queerness, Missouri just kind of ignores it, and that's somehow worse. Only 56% of students in Missouri in 2021 got any kind of discussion of queer topics in their sex education. That is the worst of all of the states that we're covering. There is a real urgency to this beyond just the fact that queer youth deserve an equal education. Project 2025 goes on a tirade against what is viewed as gender ideology in schools. They also vow to try to put way more power, more than already exists, in education back in the hands of the states with a very minimal overview. Project 2025 wants to give states as much power as possible in education as long as they are marginalizing queer students. That is a very scary world. My policy recommendation for any state that wants to have full inclusion of queer youth and full education on a wide variety of sexual topics for their whole population is that sex ed has to be mandated. It has to be funded, and it has to be fully inclusive of all populations. Without that, there is no way to have full equal access across class, race, sexuality, any identity. And that inclusion is essential to everyone having the full amount of sexual education that anyone needs to exist as an adult human in the world. While I am doing this presentation on Illinois, Kentucky, and Missouri, there's a lot of work that can be done in any state, regardless of where you are. I am doing this presentation currently in Pennsylvania, which has a D+ grade from CGIS on sex ed. I am from Tennessee, which has a C- grade. Call your representatives, talk to your school district, go to your Board of Education meetings. They might be boring, but they're incredibly important. It is at the more minute local and state levels where these policies really come into play and where we can create protections for queer youth. Absolutely, call your city councilman, call your Board of Education members, call your state rep, call your state senator, call your governor. Even if they hate you, even if they're homophobic, be annoying. That may sound silly, but these are real issues for queer youth. And they don't have the same voice that we do. They can't vote. This is a population that literally has no electoral power, no way to find a remedy for themselves outside of trying to sue the government. Be their voice, be their advocate. I'm linking resources down below. Thank you for your time. This has been Grace Doolin.